The Valkyran Empire had conquered 47 worlds in less than a year, and they never lost a single battle in all that time, because they were strong, and their soldiers were trained to kill without mercy. And when they came to the human colony, called New Terra, everyone knew what would happen next because it always happened the same way, and the aliens would land their ships and send their armies and take over the planet in a matter of hours. And that was just how things worked in this part of the galaxy where the strong took what they wanted and the weak either surrendered or died trying to resist. Commander Jektal sat in his command chair on the warship high above the planet, and he looked at the screen showing him everything he needed to know about the world below, and his 4 eyes moved independently as he studied the data and clicked his mandibles together in satisfaction because this was going to be easy, and the planet had only 3 million people living on it, and they had almost no military defenses worth mentioning, and there were a few old orbital platforms that could barely shoot straight, and a small ground force that would break and run the moment his soldiers appeared. And he had done this so many times before that he could almost predict exactly how long it would take to complete the invasion. He gave the order to begin the assault, and 10,000 soldiers loaded into the dropships, and the ships fell from orbit like burning stars, and they headed toward the capital city called Riverside, where most of the humans lived and worked and raised their families and had no idea that their peaceful lives were about to end forever. But between the landing zones and the city, there was a natural choke point called Kragan Canyon, and it was the only easy way for ground forces to reach the populated areas, and the Valkyran always preferred to control the ground before they advanced, because that was their doctrine and it had never failed them before. Lieutenant Greg Hayes had been stationed at the New Terra Defense Force for 6 years, and he was 32 years old, and he looked like any other regular guy you might pass on the street without noticing because there was nothing special about his appearance, and he had sandy brown hair and a face that people forgot easily. And he had joined the Defense Force not because he dreamed of being a hero, but because it paid decent money and let him send credits back home to Earth, where his daughter Katie lived with her mother, and he loved that little girl more than anything in the universe, and 3 days ago, he had gotten a message that made him smile for the first time in months, because Katie had been accepted to the university she had always dreamed of attending. When the invasion alert sounded, Greg was in the mess hall drinking his morning coffee and trying to wake up, and Major Lisa Crawford gathered everyone together, and there were only 43 Defense Force personnel left on the entire planet, because the rest had been reassigned months ago when the government decided New Terra was not worth defending properly. And Lisa looked at her people and told them the truth without sugarcoating anything, because she respected them too much to lie, and she said they were outgunned and outmanned and out of time, and the evacuation shuttles were already loading civilians, and they needed someone to buy those people 6 hours to get off the planet. Greg volunteered without thinking too hard about it, and he did not tell anyone why he made that choice, and he did not mention Katie, or her acceptance letter, or how he had promised her he would come home safe, and he did not talk about the thousands of children on New Terra who deserved the same chance at a future that his daughter was getting, and he just said he would do it. And Lisa looked at him for a long moment, and then nodded, because she understood that some things did not need to be explained out loud. Now Greg stood alone in the middle of Kragan Canyon, and behind him the passage narrowed to barely 50 meters wide, and it was the perfect defensive position if you knew how to use it, and Greg had trained in this canyon dozens of times over the years, and he knew every rock and every shadow and every angle of fire, and he wore standard combat armor that was scuffed and dented from years of use, and he carried a modified plasma rifle that he had customized himself, and he checked his ammunition counter in his tactical display, and he took a deep breath and waited. The first wave of Valkyran soldiers appeared at the far end of the canyon, and there were hundreds of them, and they moved with absolute confidence because they had never known defeat, and their armor gleamed in the sunlight and their weapons hummed with power, and they looked like an unstoppable force of nature. And Greg activated his helmet speakers, and his voice echoed off the canyon walls, and he said, "This canyon is closed and you need to turn back or I will defend it." And for a moment, there was complete silence. Then the Valkyran soldiers made a sound that the translator rendered as laughter, and it was harsh and clicking, and it made Greg's skin crawl, and they thought he was joking or crazy or both, because one human against hundreds was not a fight, it was a suicide. And they charged forward expecting to crush him in seconds, and Greg Hayes opened fire. His first shot took the lead Valkyran in the throat, where the armor was weakest, and the alien went down, and his second shot hit another in the visual sensor array, and his third and fourth and fifth shots found their marks with mechanical precision. And he moved between cover positions like water flowing downhill, and the narrow canyon became a killing field, because the Valkyrin could not spread out and could not flank him, and could not use their numbers to advantage, and Greg had trained for this exact scenario, and he knew Valkyrin anatomy better than most xenobiologists, because he had studied it for 6 years, and he knew exactly where to shoot to kill. The Valkyrin kept coming, and Greg kept firing, and bodies started to pile up in the canyon, and the aliens realized too late that they had walked into a trap, and they tried to fall back, but more soldiers were pushing forward from behind, and the canyon became chaos, and Greg's shots never missed and never hesitated, and he was not thinking about heroism or glory or anything, except buying time for the evacuation shuttles and keeping his promise to Katie, even though he knew he probably would not survive this day. When the first wave finally retreated, Greg counted 47 dead Valkyrin soldiers, and his ammunition was down 30%, and his armor had taken several hits, and there was a ringing in his ears from the plasma fire. But he was still standing, and the canyon was still closed and up on the command ship. Commander Jektal watched the battle footage and could not believe what he was seeing, because one human had just killed 47 of his best soldiers, and that should not have been possible. Commander Jektal watched the screens in front of him, and he felt something he had not felt in a very long time, and that feeling was doubt, because the battle footage showed something that made no sense according to everything he knew about warfare and tactics, and the human had killed 47 soldiers in 17 minutes, and every shot had been perfect, and every movement had been calculated, and the human had used the canyon itself as a weapon and turned what should have been an easy advance into a slaughter. And Jektal's tactical officer stood nearby, and his voice trembled when he spoke, because he had never seen anything like this either. The tactical officer explained that the human was exploiting the canyon's natural geometry, and the narrow passage prevented the Valkyrin from using their superior numbers, and they could not flank or surround, and their advantage in firepower meant nothing when they could only advance a few soldiers at a time, and the human kept moving between positions and shooting from different angles. And it was like fighting a ghost that appeared and disappeared at will, and Jektal ground his mandibles together and felt his pride warring with his common sense. He considered sending his forces around the canyon using air assault, but that would take time and allow the civilians to escape, and his orders from the Emperor were clear that they needed to capture the population for labor conscription, because the Valkyrin Empire always needed more workers for their factories and mines, and if he let the humans evacuate, then this whole invasion would be pointless, and he would have to explain to his superiors how one human soldier had ruined everything, and that thought made him angry. Jektal ordered a second wave, and this time he sent 200 soldiers, and he told them to use overwhelming firepower, and to bring portable shield generators, and to advance carefully, and not to underestimate the enemy. And the soldiers loaded into their dropships and descended to the canyon, and they were more cautious this time because they had seen what happened to the first wave, and they knew this human was dangerous. Greg Hayes leaned against the canyon wall and took a few deep breaths, and his armor was smoking in places where plasma bolts had struck, and his tactical display showed the second wave approaching, and he checked his ammunition and saw that he was down to 70%, and his left shoulder hurt from the recoil of sustained firing, but he could still fight. And that was all that mattered, and Lisa Crawford's voice came through his helmet comm and asked for a status report. He told her he was still breathing and still fighting, and she told him the evacuation was 23% complete, and they needed more time. And he said she would get it, and he meant every word, because there was no way he was leaving this canyon until those civilians were safe. And he thought about Katie and her acceptance letter, and how she deserved to grow up in a universe where people stood up for what was right, even when the odds were impossible. The second wave entered the canyon behind a wall of energy shields that glowed blue in the sunlight, and they advanced slowly, and their shields absorbed Greg's initial shots. And he realized quickly that conventional firing would not work against this tactic, and the Valkyrin thought they had solved the problem, but Greg had studied shield technology, and he knew that shields required power, and power cells could be overloaded if you hit them hard enough and long enough. He switched his rifle to sustained beam mode and focused all his fire on a single shield generator, and the unit started to whine as its power cell climbed toward critical levels, and the Valkyrin soldiers behind that shield realized what was happening and tried to fall back. But they were too slow, and the shield generator exploded with enough force to take out 26 soldiers in a single blast, and the explosion echoed through the canyon like thunder. In the chaos that followed, Greg moved like water between his cover positions, and his shots found targets with mechanical precision, and he had memorized every weak point in Valkyran armor during his 6 years of study, and that knowledge combined with his intimate familiarity with this canyon made him more than just a soldier, and he was the canyon's guardian, and he would not be moved, and he would not surrender, and he would not fail. The Valkyran soldiers tried to coordinate their assault, but the narrow canyon made communication difficult, and the smoke from the explosion reduced visibility, and Greg used every trick he had learned in training, and he fired from unexpected angles, and disappeared before return fire could find him, and he made the canyon into a maze where death waited around every corner, and the Valkyran started to break in panic, because they could not fight what they could not see. By the time the second wave retreated, Greg had been fighting for 1 hour and 43 minutes without a break, and his ammunition was down to 40%, and his armor had taken multiple hits that would have killed a less experienced soldier, and his left arm hung at an odd angle, and something was definitely broken. But the adrenaline kept the pain manageable, and he could still hold his rifle, and that was enough. He sat down heavily against the canyon wall and checked his tactical display, and saw that the evacuation was up to 68% complete, and that meant 900,000 people were still on the ground, and still in danger, and he had to hold for at least another 4 hours, and he wondered if he had enough ammunition to last that long, and whether his body would hold out even if the ammunition did. Lisa Crawford's voice came through the comm again, and she sounded worried, and she told him they were reading heavy armor on approach and he needed to fall back and find a better position. But Greg said negative because there was no better position, and the canyon was the choke point, and if he left it, then the Valkyran would pour through and catch the evacuation shuttles on the ground, and all of this would have been for nothing. He asked how many civilians were still planetside, and Lisa paused before answering, and said approximately 900,000, and Greg closed his eyes for a moment and thought about all those people, and all those families, and all those children, who just wanted to live their lives in peace, and he said, "Then I hold," and Lisa did not argue because she knew there was no point. The ground started to vibrate, and Greg heard the mechanical thunder of approaching armor, and the Valkyran were bringing vehicles into the canyon, which was a tactical risk given the narrow space, but it showed they were willing to take chances now, and they wanted this over with, and Greg stood up despite the pain in his arm, and moved to a new firing position, because the Valkyran had learned to anticipate his previous locations, and he needed to keep them guessing. The third wave entered the canyon with 500 soldiers and 3 armored hover tanks in the lead, and the tanks had heavy shields and thick armor, and they could absorb tremendous punishment, and the infantry followed close behind using the tanks as cover, and it was a sound strategy, and Greg knew he could not win a straight fight against that much firepower, but he did not need to win, he just needed to delay. Greg watched the lead hover tank advance down the canyon, and he knew that firing directly at it would be useless because the shields and armor were too strong, and his plasma rifle did not have enough power to penetrate, but he had fought in this canyon for years, and he knew every rock formation and every weakness in the stone walls, and he had an idea that might work if he timed it perfectly. He waited until the lead tank was exactly 40 meters away, and positioned directly under a natural overhang of rock that jutted out from the canyon wall, and then he aimed not at the tank, but at the stone above it, and fired a sustained plasma beam that superheated the rock and caused it to fracture and crack, and suddenly tons of stone came crashing down on top of the tank. The tank's shields flared bright blue and tried to absorb the impact, but shields were designed to stop energy weapons, not physical mass, and the weight of the falling rock overwhelmed the shield generators and crushed them, and the tank itself was flattened like a tin can under a hammer, and it blocked the entire width of the canyon passage, and the soldiers behind it were trapped. Greg did not waste the opportunity, and he fired into the confused mass of Valkyran infantry, and each shot found a target, and soldiers fell, and the aliens tried to return fire, but they were packed too tightly together, and their shots hit their own people as often as they came close to Greg, and the canyon became a scene of chaos and panic. The Valkyran commander on the ground ordered his troops to fall back and regroup, but the narrow passage made retreat difficult, and Greg kept firing with mechanical precision, and he had stopped thinking about individual targets and was just shooting at the mass of alien soldiers and trusting his training. and his knowledge of their weak points. A plasma bolt seared past his helmet so close that he felt the heat through his armor, and another shot struck his chest plate, and the impact knocked him backwards and he fell hard, and his rifle skittered across the stone floor and slid out of reach, and Greg lay there gasping for breath and waiting for the killing shot that would end everything. But the shot did not come, and Greg slowly raised his head and saw that the Valkyran soldiers had stopped shooting, and they stood in a loose semicircle with their weapons pointed at him, but not firing. And through the smoke and dust, a figure emerged, who was larger than the other soldiers and wore armor covered in symbols that Greg's translator identified as marks of high rank. Commander Jektal had come down to the canyon himself because he needed to see this human with his own eyes and understand what kind of warrior could hold off an entire army. And he walked slowly toward Greg, and his 4 eyes studied the human carefully, and he saw the damaged armor and the broken arm and the exhaustion that showed in every line of the human's body. But he also saw something else, and that was determination and courage, and a refusal to quit even when defeat was certain. Jektal stopped 10 meters from where Greg sat against the canyon wall, and he spoke, and his voice was translated into human language by both their communication systems, and he asked why one soldier would resist an entire empire when the outcome was inevitable, and when there was no hope of victory. Greg levered himself into a sitting position, and every movement sent fresh pain through his broken ribs and damaged arm, but he kept his voice steady when he answered, and he said, "Because someone has to." And those 4 words contained everything. He believed about duty and responsibility and standing up for what was right, even when it seemed pointless. Jektal's mandibles clicked together in what Greg had learned to recognize as a sign of deep thought, and the alien commander said that Greg had killed 643 Valkyran soldiers and delayed an entire invasion fleet, and he was just one human defending a species that had abandoned him on this remote colony, with inadequate support and old equipment and no reinforcements coming. The commander gestured at Greg's damaged armor and depleted weapons and asked, where was the human fleet and where were the reinforcements and why was Greg fighting alone? And Greg told him the truth and said that help was not coming because Terra was too small and too far away, and by the time any rescue force arrived, the planet would already be conquered. Jektal asked then why fight at all if defeat was certain, and Greg thought about Katie and her acceptance letter and the future she deserved, and he thought about the 900,000 people still evacuating, and people he had never met but whose lives depended on every minute he could buy them. And he said simply, because it is right. The alien commander was silent for a long moment, and in his many years of military service he had conquered dozens of species, and some had fought bravely, while others surrendered immediately. But none had shown such individual determination and sacrifice, and the humans had been described to him as weak and divided and emotional and tactically predictable. But this human was none of those things. Jektal made a decision that would have surprised his superiors and shocked his fellow commanders, and he offered Greg terms of surrender and said that if Greg would give up the canyon now, then the Valkyran would allow the human civilians to evacuate without further interference, and they would be treated honorably as refugees and not as prisoners. Greg's first reaction was disbelief, because why would an invading army offer terms to a defeated enemy who had no leverage and no ability to bargain? And he laughed bitterly and said, "Why should I trust the word of an invading force that has come to conquer my people?" Jektal's response was interesting, and he said that Greg should trust the word of a soldier who recognizes courage when he sees it, and that he was giving his oath as war commander of the Valkyran 7th Fleet, and that among his people such oaths were sacred and could not be broken without bringing dishonor that would last for generations. Greg looked at his tactical display and saw that the evacuation was at 81% complete, and that meant another hour, and everyone would be safe. And could he trust this alien commander, and did he have any choice? And he said he needed proof and told Jektal to pull back all Valkyran forces so Greg could verify the withdrawal. Jektal considered this request, and then activated his command channel and ordered all units to fall back 2 kilometers and maintain defensive posture only. And Greg watched his tactical display as the red dots representing enemy forces began to move away from the canyon, and it could be a trick designed to make him lower his guard, but something in Jektal's bearing suggested otherwise. There was a formality to the alien commander's movements and a ritualistic quality to his words that spoke of deeply ingrained codes of honor and military tradition, and Greg had spent 6 years studying the Valkyran, and he knew they valued honor above almost everything else, and perhaps that was something he could trust. Lisa Crawford's voice crackled in his ear and asked what was happening down in the canyon, because they were reading a massive Valkyran withdrawal, and Greg said simply that he was negotiating, and Lisa asked if he could trust them, and Greg looked at Jektal and said he thought so. Lisa told Greg that the evacuation was at 89% complete, and they needed just 43 more minutes to get everyone off the planet and into the waiting transport ships, and Greg made his decision and told Commander Jektal that he would accept the surrender terms on one condition, and that condition was that the Valkyran would wait until the last evacuation shuttle cleared orbit before advancing, and that no harm would come to any of the civilians. Jektal gave his word and said that the Valkyran would honor the agreement, and Greg took a deep breath and said, "Then I surrender this position," and the alien commander ordered his medical personnel to come forward and treat Greg's injuries, and the medics approached cautiously because they had never treated a human before, but they worked with surprising gentleness as they set his broken arm and bandaged his damaged ribs. Greg was taken up to the Valkyran command ship in orbit, and he watched through the observation windows as the evacuation continued below, and shuttle after shuttle rose from New Terra's surface, carrying people to safety. And he thought about how strange it was to be standing on an alien warship watching his own people escape, while being treated as an honored prisoner rather than an enemy. Jektal stood beside him at the observation deck, and together they watched the last shuttle lift off exactly 6 hours and 12 minutes after the invasion began, and the alien commander said that Greg's people were escaping because of him, and that one human holding a canyon against an empire seemed impossible, but it had happened. Greg corrected him and said it was not impossible, it was necessary, and there was a difference between those two things, and Jektal's mandibles clicked in what Greg now recognized as agreement, and the commander said that his report to the Emperor would note what had happened here, and that Greg would be recorded in Valkyran military history as a warrior worthy of respect. Greg said he would rather just go home and see his daughter, and Jektal told him that was already arranged and that a neutral transport would take him to the nearest human-controlled system, and that he was free to go, and Greg was surprised and asked if it was really that simple. The alien commander said yes, it was that simple, because Greg had fought with honor and accepted the surrender terms, and to hold him prisoner would violate those terms, and the Valkyran did not break oaths given in combat. And then Jektal asked if he could pose a question, and Greg said yes. Jektal explained that he had reviewed Greg's military training records, and they showed him as average in marksmanship and tactics and physical conditioning, and there was nothing exceptional about his scores or his performance evaluations, but yet he had fought like one of the Valkyran's greatest champions and killed 643 soldiers, while holding an impossible position, and the commander wanted to know how. Greg thought about the question and considered all the hours of combat and the shots that had found their marks and the strength he had found when his body wanted to quit, and finally he said that he fought for something bigger than himself, and that every shot was not about killing Valkyran soldiers, but about saving the people evacuating behind him. And when you fight for others, you find strength you did not know you had. Jektal absorbed this answer, and his 4 eyes reflected something that might have been understanding, and he said that the Valkyran fight for glory and conquest, and the expansion of their empire, but perhaps that was why one human was worth 600 of his soldiers, because fighting for others created a different kind of motivation than fighting for personal gain. 3 days later, Greg Hayes arrived at the human station orbiting Proxima Centauri, and the news of New Terra's evacuation had spread through human space like wildfire, and with it came the story of the lone soldier who held a canyon against an entire invasion force, and when Greg's transport docked at the station, he was met by reporters and military officials and civilians who all wanted to shake his hand and hear his story. He endured the attention with quiet patience and answered questions when he had to, and deflected praise whenever possible, because all he wanted was to get home to Earth and see Katie and tell her about the universe she was about to enter through her university education and how proud he was of her. Major Lisa Crawford found him in a quiet corridor away from the crowds, and she had made it off New Terra with the last wave of evacuees, and she had been instrumental in coordinating the final stages of the evacuation, and she looked at Greg and said simply that he was a hero. Greg shook his head and said he was just a soldier who did his job and nothing more, but Lisa disagreed and told him that he was more than that, and that the Valkyran were spreading the story too, and Commander Jektal's report had been distributed. throughout their empire, and they were calling Greg the Canyon Guardian, and some of their military philosophers were writing treatises about individual courage versus collective strength. Greg smiled slightly and said he was glad to contribute to alien philosophy, but Lisa insisted that he had changed something important and explained that the Valkyran Empire had never offered surrender terms before and had never shown mercy to a defeated enemy, but Greg had made them see humans differently. He said that he only made one commander see one human differently, and that was all, but Lisa told him that was everything, because wars were not just fought with weapons and ships, but with perceptions and beliefs. And Greg had shown the Valkyran that humans were not weak and that even alone and outnumbered a human would stand and fight for what mattered. Greg thought about Jektal's words in the canyon and the way the Valkyran soldiers had stopped firing when their commander arrived. And maybe Lisa was right, and maybe one person could change the calculations and alter the equations that empires used to measure their enemies, but he still felt like he had just been doing what needed to be done. Lisa told him that 900,000 people were alive because of him, and they were going to tell their children and grandchildren about the day one human stood alone and held back an army, and that story was going to spread and become something bigger than any of them could imagine. 6 months passed, and Greg Hayes sat in his small apartment on Earth and watched his daughter Katie pack for university. And she was excited and nervous in equal measure, and she kept looking at her acceptance letter that she had framed and hung on her wall, and Greg felt proud and grateful that he had been able to give her this chance. On her last night home, Katie said she had been reading about what happened on New Terra, and Greg set down his fork and said he did not really want to talk about it. But Katie insisted and said she needed to say something, and she looked him in the eye and thanked him for being brave and for standing up when it mattered, and for showing her what it means to fight for others. Greg tried to brush off her words and said he was just doing his job, but Katie shook her head firmly and told him no. He was being a hero, and specifically her hero, and that meant everything to her. And Greg felt tears in his eyes for the first time since the battle, and he reached across the table and took his daughter's hand. He told her that he did it all for her, and that every shot and every stand in that canyon had been done while thinking about her and her future, and Katie whispered that she knew, and that she was going to make it count, and she promised him that she would work hard and make him proud. The next day, Greg watched his daughter head off to university, and as she disappeared into the crowd of students, he thought about Commander Jektal and the canyon, and the weight of standing alone against impossible odds, and the story had spread, exactly as Lisa predicted, and throughout human space people spoke of the Canyon Guardian and the soldier who refused to yield. But Greg knew the truth that others did not see because he had been there and lived through it, and he knew he had not been invincible or superhuman or anything special, and he had been scared and injured and outgunned and running on empty for most of that battle. What he had possessed was purpose, and that was different from power or skill, because purpose came from having a clear understanding of why you fought and who you fought for, and that understanding gave you the strength to keep going when your body wanted to quit and your mind told you it was hopeless. That was the real lesson of the canyon, and it was not that one human could defeat an army through superior tactics or better training, but that one person, fighting for the right reasons, could accomplish things that seemed impossible and could change the course of events in ways that rippled outward far beyond the immediate battle. Somewhere in the depths of space, on a Valkyran warship crossing the void between stars, Commander Jektal sat in his quarters and read the report he had written about the battle at Kragan Canyon. And he thought about the human who had taught an empire the meaning of true courage. The title of that report, when translated into human language, read simply, "The Day We Learned to Respect Humanity." And it would not be the last such report, because the story of Greg Hayes and the canyon was spreading through both human and Valkyran space, and changing how both species viewed each other. The Valkyran had always measured strength in numbers and firepower and territory controlled, but now their military academies were studying the battle at Kragan Canyon and asking new questions about what made a warrior effective and whether individual determination could overcome numerical superiority under the right circumstances. Human commanders were analyzing Greg's tactics and the way he had used terrain and knowledge of enemy weaknesses to multiply his effectiveness, and they were incorporating those lessons into their training programs and teaching young soldiers that sometimes the most important weapon was not the one in your hands, but the reason in your heart. The neutral zone between human and Valkyran space became less hostile, as both sides remembered the honor shown at Kragan Canyon, and when diplomats met to discuss borders and trade agreements, They referenced the battle as an example of how enemies could find common ground through mutual respect. Greg Hayes became something he never wanted to be, and that was a symbol. And his face appeared on recruiting posters, and his story was told in schools, and parents used him as an example when teaching their children about courage and sacrifice, and doing the right thing even when it cost you everything. He tried to live a quiet life and avoided interviews and public appearances as much as possible, because he did not feel comfortable with the attention, and he thought there were plenty of other soldiers who deserved recognition just as much as he did. But the universe had decided he was special, and there was nothing he could do to change that. Sometimes late at night when he could not sleep, Greg would stand at his window and look up at the stars and think about the canyon, and the hours he spent there fighting for every second, and buying time for people he would never meet, and he wondered if he would do it again, if given the choice. The answer was always yes, because that was who he was, and that was what duty meant, and no amount of fame or recognition could change the fundamental truth that some things were worth fighting for, and some stands had to be made regardless of the cost. Katie wrote to him from university, and told him about her classes and her friends and her dreams for the future, and every letter reminded him why he had stood in that canyon and refused to move, and he saved every letter in a box beside his bed, and read them when he needed to remember what mattered. Years passed, and the story of the Canyon Guardian became legend, and new details were added with each retelling, and some of them were true while others were embellishments, but the core remained the same. And that core was about one person making a difference when it seemed impossible. Historians studied the battle and wrote papers analyzing Greg's tactics, and psychologists examined his motivations, and philosophers debated the nature of heroism and whether it came from within or was created by circumstances, and Greg ignored all of it because he knew the truth was simpler than any of them wanted to admit. He had been a regular soldier in the right place at the right time, fighting for people he loved and people he did not know, but who deserved protection, and that was all there was to it, and trying to make it more complicated than that missed the point entirely. The Valkyrian Empire changed too, and though they continued to expand and conquer, they began to offer terms more frequently and treat defeated enemies with greater respect, and some historians credited this shift to the report Commander Jektal had, written in the way it had challenged their assumptions about strength and honor. Jektal himself rose to high rank within the Valkyrian military, and he never forgot the human who had stood alone in a canyon and taught an empire a lesson about courage, and whenever young officers asked him about the secret to victory, he would tell them about Greg Hayes and the importance of understanding why you fight. Greg Hayes lived to see his daughter graduate from university and start her own career and eventually have children of her own. And when his grandchildren asked him to tell them about the canyon, he would smile and give them a simplified version that left out the fear and pain and focused on the importance of standing up for others. The universe turned and stars burned and civilizations rose and fell. But the story of one human who stood alone and held back an entire army endured, because it spoke to something fundamental about the nature of courage and sacrifice, and the power of individual action in the face of overwhelming odds. And in the end, that was Greg Hayes' true legacy. And it was not the medals or the statues or the history books, but rather the simple truth that he had shown both humans and aliens alike, that sometimes one person standing in the right place for the right reasons could change everything.